it's a pleasure to welcome you here. These events, we've got 4 paintings over these coming 12 months now, and it's been created by Peter Lord here. It's his idea. You may remember we first did an exhibition with Peter a couple of years back now, the Welsh Artisan exhibition, which was a great success, one of the best exhibitions we've had here. I think Peter Lord is is our greatest art historian in Wales. No doubt his head is swelling there now, but he's quite shy as well. But having 2 of them in the same room as well. But Peter will be presenting Miles to you now. But thank you, Miles, for coming all the way, and obviously for lending this wonderful painting to us. Glyn-y-Weddw, I was brought up in Devon, not far from Glyn-y-Weddw, so this painting has real relevance to the peninsula. So if you can please put your hands together for Peter Lord and mileswyncato.
Gwnawn i gyd, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd am ddod allan o'r pnawn mor braf. Fel mae'n wedi troi allan, mae'n hyfryd gweld cynnig ohonoch chi yma. Dwi'n mynd i siarad am hir, jyst cyflwyno'r llyfr sydd gen i. I've known Miles for, how long have I known Miles for? 23 years. 23 years, there we are. And Miles was trained as a historian, but I know him specifically for his work as an art historian and for the gallery that he runs in London, which deals in Welsh painting. And I just wanted to say a word about Miles' work in that particular field, because I first met Miles, I think I'm right in saying, when he contacted me with a painting by William Roos, a portrait by William Roos. And I remember going up to London and going to, it was before you had the gallery, wasn't it, Miles? I went to, it was at your house, I think, the Liverpool house you had. And going and seeing this William Roos, and it was the first William Roos that I bought. I got 12 of them, I think 13 of them. Most of them have come through Miles. Miles' contribution in finding Welsh pictures, in not only in England, but in the United States as well, and bringing them back and finding buyers for them inside Wales, bringing back the visual heritage of Wales has been of enormous importance. And I'm not just saying that because he's here, it's been hugely important. I can't tell you how many pictures have come back, and significant pictures as well, because as you'll discover, it was Miles who identified that picture, for instance, which was masquerading as something else. So his contribution behind the scenes to the work that I do in writing about these pictures has been enormous. He is a specialist mainly on the 18th century. I was setting that there, isn't it, Miles? And Parry has been his great study, and I do commend you, he's written a wonderful book on William Parry, which you can buy from the gallery over there. That's all I've got to say, and I look forward very much to hearing what Miles is going to say to you now. Thanks. I hope you do the technology.
Diolch yn fawr, Peter, Gwyn. Bleser i ni cael bod yma heddiw. Rwy'n gweithio yn mwynhau'r Gwynalaeth. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very flattered by what both Gwyn and Peter said. I don't consider myself to be an art historian. I'm very much amateur antiquarian, really, but certainly feel very flattered to be bracketed with Peter in that way, but that's a great honour. Anyway, but I do have a great passion for 18th century Welsh painting, well, Welsh painting throughout ages, but particularly this period. And I was just very fortunate really with William Parry, because I was lucky enough a long time ago, well 20 years ago, to come across, as so often happens in my business, in a very unexpected way, to come across somebody who had through inheritance, a collection of paintings and drawings by William Parry, and there was really nothing known about him at that point. But I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, which is a lot. Often what happens in my business occasionally when one gets lucky. But I'm going to try and tell you a bit about why this is an important picture, the big picture. It's a great honour. I'm delighted to have lent this picture for this exhibition here, and very, as Gwyn said, in a place that's very appropriate for it. And I think the thing about this picture, and all the pictures I'm going to talk about, what one has to think about looking at this picture is it's a big picture in Welsh terms because of 3 factors really. One is it's a portrait of one of the most important Welshmen of his period, cultural figures. John Parry was considered to be, really considered to be the primary Welsh harpist of the 18th century, which was obviously quite an accolade given how important harp always has been in Wales. Also, although this particular picture probably wasn't painted for Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn, it's very important with Parry to consider that he's intimately connected with the Williams-Wynn family, so the most important and powerful family in Wales in the 18th century. And then, obviously, you've got William Parry himself, who was an artist who stands out in Wales in the second half of the 18th century because he really was unique. I don't use that word lightly, but he had this very important patronage within Wales, and he had a practice within Wales, and he made a living within Wales painting Welsh patrons, and there was nobody else in that who could be practiced alongside him in that way. So, patron, the Williams-Wynns; sitter, John Parry; artist, William Parry. So there's a sort of triple aspect to this painting, which is what makes it very important. As well, and I'll talk about it a bit more later on, but as well as obviously just the actual painting itself is, you know, mysterious, powerful, and kind of quite a spiritual kind of picture. Anyway, we'll start and have a look at some people who could do it. Oh, 10 minutes.
Where is it? Is it on the back?
So this is obviously the man himself. This is actually the only image we have of William Parry. There was a miniature of him exhibited by a friend of his called Isaiah Humphrey at the Royal Academy, but that's been lost, and so often is the case in this period of history. And I'm sure William Parry painted his own portrait. Seems inconceivable he wouldn't have done. And he may well have been painted by any number of his friends in the art world at that period. But we don't have another picture of him other than this etching. This is by Edward Edwards, you can see him put in 1804. He was an artist and an art historian, really, of Welsh descent. In 1808, he wrote a book called Anecdotes of Painters, and it's incredibly important. It's only about 2 pages long, but it gives a summary of William Parry's life and his work. And that really has been the basis for all the subsequent information about Parry. He knew him, and he was drawing on first-hand accounts of his life. But amazingly, and this is another thing I really want to emphasise, Edward Edwards' account, his book, Anecdotes of Painters, and therefore his account of William Parry, was published in 1808. My book was published in 2008, so that's 200 years. Virtually nothing was written about William Parry in between. There's never been an exhibition of his work, amazingly. And although the National Museum of Wales, or the Fairclough, produced a short summary of his life in 2004 in a kind of museum publication, internal museum publication, between 1808 and 2008, there was really nothing about him at all. So he really is one of those painters who qualifies as somebody who's been very largely forgotten. Next one, please, Peter. So this is an image of portrait by Hudson of Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn. This is the 3rd baronet, born in 1692, fell off his horse in 1749 and broke his neck. He was the most important and powerful Welshman in Wales in the sort of early to mid-18th century. He was a great Jacobite. Outside Scotland, he was the leader of the Jacobites, so including Shropshire and Cheshire and the northwest of England and Wales. So he was a very important force in British politics in his time. And he was certainly implicated in the 1745, the Rising. And it's always been a matter of debate why he didn't actually go and join up with Bonnie Prince Charlie and join his army at Derby for the march south. And there's a lot of debate about whether his nerve failed him and all sorts of reasons. But he was a very, very important man. the Griffith family of Cavanagh, which is obviously up this way. But after that, he became Harpist to Sir Mileswyncato. And Sir Watkin had a house in London because he was very active in Parliament, as well as Wednesday, his main seat in Wales. And John Parry played the organ in St James's Church in Piccadilly, played the organ at Wednesday, and he toured all around Britain during his time when he was patronised by Sir Watkin and supported by him, and became his fame was growing rapidly. The year before William Parry was born, 1742, John Parry published the first of his books of music called Ancient British Music, and that was something that did a great deal to enhance his reputation. So, although most of the story about William Parry concerns the fourth baronet, this man's son, we can't underestimate how important it was that William Parry's father was patronised by the third baronet, Sir Mileswyncato. And when he died in 1749, unexpectedly, his widow, who was much younger than him, actually his goddaughter, she continued to patronise John Parry, and it was her and John Parry who sent the young William Parry off to London to train as a painter. Next one, please. So this is a drawing which has survived in the Royal Society of Arts in London by the young William Parry, who was sent off down to an art institution run by someone called William Shipley, which was one of the first art schools in London. The timing of William Parry's emergence as an artist was very auspicious because the art world was changing hugely in Britain, and these art academies were really had really just begun in London. So for artists of the previous generation, the only thing to do was to go and be apprenticed to another painter, whereas William Parry was almost the first generation where you could go and train in art schools in London. And basically what they did, these young men, was they would go and draw very largely from classical statuary, like this. This is the Borghese Gladiator. And they would do these black chalk drawings and learn to draw. And you can see, I mean, he was 16 or thereabouts when he drew this, about 1759. And it's a very accomplished drawer. He won some prizes for his drawing, but it gave him a very good grounding in the basics of his drawing. So he would have done lots and lots of drawings like this, in common with so much of his art and other painters of the period. Very few of them survive, just this one. Next one, please. And this is where, really, the next Sir Watkin Mileswyncato, the fourth baronet, who's the gentleman on the left, some of you may recognise. May recognise this picture. It's famous. Sorry, it's not a great reproduction. You can see the original in the National Museum of Wales, which looks a lot better than this. But it's a wonderful picture by Pompeo Bottoni, painted in Italy when Sir Watkin on the left was on his grand tour. It's the only triple full-length portrait that Pompeo Bottoni painted of British cities, so it's quite immaculate. It's commissioned by a Welshman. So here's Sir Watkin and his friends on his grand tour, which he undertook in 1768, and it gave him an enormous passion for art. He was already very interested in music, and he was out there for the best part of the year. He wasn't terribly enthusiastic about the abroad, nor was William Parry, to be honest. They didn't like the garlic, and they weren't all that keen on foreigners. So they both came back with a great admiration for classical art and architecture and history. So next one, please. This rather wonderful vessel is just by way of introducing what happened to William Parry after he finished his training in London. He went from Shipley School to something called the Duke of Richmond's Academy, which was another drawing school set up by the Duke of Richmond. And then he went to train with Sir Joshua Reynolds, and this is very interesting because this is another point at which you can see how influential the Mileswyncatos were with all the Parry, both John Parry and William Parry, because they knew, not only did they know Shipley, whose school he went to originally, but also young Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn was becoming a serious patron of Sir Joshua Reynolds, and William Parry went to work for Reynolds as one of his. He always had about 3 apprentices, Reynolds. And of course, he was the most successful portrait painter in London at the time, so it was a great thing to go and work in his studio, and they learned a great deal very fast. But there was a real overlap between Sir Watkin's patronage of Reynolds and Parry again being within his studio. In 1768, when William Parry was 25, we have a very, very important record of him coming back to London, coming back to Wales, with a friend of his called John Jackson, who was a theatrical manager, and he toured around, mostly in Merioneth, but also came out to Carnarvonshire. And the letters that John Jackson wrote back describing their tour together survived, and they're very, very important because they put Parry back in North Wales at an early age, painting and drawing, and they just demonstrate his commitment to his own country. And when he left Reynolds a year later, it was really the crucial point, and I think it's what the pivotal point in Parry's career, because so many painters in his shoes would have just stayed in London and tried to carve out a career in London, which is obviously the hub of the art world in Britain. But William Parry chose to come back to Wales, and he went back to Winstay in Denbighshire, and met up with Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn, who'd just come back from his grand tour, full of enthusiasm, very rich, had a long minority. His mother had stewarded the estates very well, so there was plenty of money. And Sir Watkin was very keen to get on and rebuild his house and patronise artists and everything. And patronage was the key issue for these painters in the period. So one might think, well, Parry obviously would have come back and worked for Sir Watkin because that's where the money was going to be, and there probably is some truth in that. But I think there was also a sort of patriotic tendency in him as well. And he came back, and the first thing that happened was that Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn was coming of age in 1770, because his father had been dead for 21 years since he was a child. The Williams-Wynns were very keen to reassert themselves on the sort of political and national stage in Wales, and there was this amazing event at Winstay and all the other estates for the coming of age. This beautiful neoclassical vessel, which is right out of sort of ancient Rome, gives a very good insight into what Sir Watkin was sort of thinking at that period, having come back from his grand tour. Beautiful thing, covered in leather, painted with an ox head. They roasted an ox. In fact, one of the paintings that William Parry did in this period was called The Great Ox. It shows how versatile he was, that he could paint the beast that was roasted for the coming of age celebration. And you can just see some words on the silver at the top, and really it's a piece of poetry, I think, relating to this great feast they had for the coming of age. I found this jug in Australia about 3 years ago. It wasn't recognised what it was, but it was a very exciting thing to find. There were 2 of them in the National Museum of Wales. So he came back, and he was there in 1770, and the whole of Winstay was a crucible for the Williams-Wynns and the Parrys and everybody else. John Parry was there playing the organ. He was on £100 a year at Winstay on the staff. His other son, David Parry, who was also a musician, was paid to sing and to play in Rewabon Church. And then William Parry came back to join them. So they were all there, these Parrys, working for the Williams-Wynns. And this is the really sort of almost the most important period really for William Parry, because he come back to Wales into this firmament of excitement around the coming of age celebration with this patron who was keen to spend his money on art, on music, on building. And William Parry, for about 2 years before he went off to Italy for the first time under Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn's patronage, painted a number of Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn's friends and families and children particularly in the vicinity of Winstay, which is what Edward Edwards tells us in his account. And so here he is establishing himself with Welsh patrons in Wales, and he's left some very wonderful images behind. some of those pictures survive from this period. Peter, if you could do this. So this is a very good example of the sort of thing he painting. This is painted in about 1770. A little girl, someone called Frances Pulliston. And they were a family from near Winstead. The Pullistons, long established in Wales, lived in a house called Emerald Hall, where there were various branches. And they were great Jacobites. As I mentioned before, Sir Watkin Williams, the third Baronet, was the leader of the Jacobites, and he established a Jacobite society in Wales called the Cycle of the White Rose in 1715. And when it first started, it was quite seditious. I mean, it was quite a sort of serious political organisation. And these various gentlemen who were sympathetic to the cause would meet at each other's houses in rotation, which is why it was called the Cycle. And it continued the cycle right into the middle of the 19th century. But obviously, once the Jacobite rebellions had passed, it became much more of a sort of social and drinking club for these gentlemen, and it gradually grew bigger and bigger. But the Pullistons had been members of the cycle from an early period, and they were very good friends of the Williams-Wynns. Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn also established a theatre at Winstead, which some of you may have heard of, and the Pullistons were, it was an amateur theatricals. The Pullistons often appeared on the playbills as acting at Winstead as well. Anyway, this is Frances Pulliston, so she's the daughter of one of these Jacobite friends of Sir Watkin. And this is absolutely typical of what Parry was doing at the period. But it's also very interesting because this picture, which was at a house called Gwasanni outside Mull, nobody ever knew it was painted by William Parry. It had been attributed to an artist called Davis, an artist called Weekly, Zoffany, all these different painters. And this is something one finds all the time in Parry, because he'd been forgotten largely by the sort of middle to late 19th century. When art historians, particularly in the 20th century, came to look at pictures like this and try and work out who they were by, they would have these great discussions, but William Parry's name never came into the conversation because they just didn't realise that there was somebody of Parry's stature, straight out of Reynolds's studio, straight out of Royal Academy schools, painting in Wales in this period. So all these other artists get considered for these paintings, but never William Parry. Anyway, we'll see another one in a minute, and when you see that, you'll see why it's very obvious this is by William Parry. Next one. This is a series of chalk portraits, which is something that William Parry produced throughout his career. The man on the left, top and bottom, you can see it's the same man, something called Owen Wynne. Not a close relation of the Williams-Wynns, but he had an estate near Oswestry, and he also had an estate in Meirionydd. And he was one of William Parry's major patrons at this time, but he was a Jacobite, he was another member of the cycle. And he commissioned this set of drawings, very likely at a meeting of the cycle at his house, one of his houses in 1770. It ties in exactly. And you can see it's quite a large series of portraits, and you see a couple of them in more detail. So there's a good close-up. You can see one of the characteristics of William Parry is there's a lot of character in the faces. You know, they're formal portraits in a sense, but they're not kind of overly formal. And one has a sense from these pictures and also from some of the surviving documentation that William Parry was very at ease with the gentry in Wales. You know, the Welsh gentry in this period, I'll include Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn, there was less delineation between the gentry and the ordinary people than is sometimes imagined. And William Parry sat very comfortably alongside these people. And we've got records of him, for instance, there's a house called Reed near Corwin, and we've got a very amusing record of him going there for a New Year's Eve party. I can't remember the exact date, sometime in the 1770s or 80s, and dressing up as a Spaniard and causing great mirth with his dancing. So he was very, although he was as an artist, he wasn't considered to be on the level of the servants. He was uniform must be a uniform worn by members of the cycle. And we'll see another one. There's another one, you know, again, just a good example, with a lot of sort of character in the face. You can see how accomplished he is, and he's obviously caught a very good likeness. These are about this sort of size, these pictures. Next one, please. And there's Owen Wynn's eldest son, and I think if you think back to the one we saw a couple of minutes ago, the little girl, the bird, you can see how similar they are. Harry often likes to put his sitters under a sort of spreading tree and in a landscape which one can sort of broadly think of as a sort of Welsh landscape, the mountains and the river. This picture actually very helpfully is signed on the tree, William Parry, and the name of the sitter. But that's very unusual. I think that it's very easy to forget that very few painters of this period signed their pictures. You know, I mean, for instance, we talked about Reynolds earlier. Virtually none of sort of Joshua Reynolds' painters are signed. People always think, how do you know who the pictures are by? The reason is we know they're by is because sometimes we know through documentation, or in fact some of them are signed, what some of them look like, and we kind of work from there. And the fact that in 1770, in this period of fruitfulness at Winstead, William Parry did sign a couple of his pictures, this one and another one, is absolutely crucial. Because I think if we didn't have these couple of signed things, his loss would have been even more profound. But anyway, this one is signed. He didn't continue to sign. It's a very lovely thing. It's the National Museum of Wales. And so you can go and see that. Next one, please. Also in 1770, and also for Owen Wynn, he did a series of these black and white drawings, which are personally my favourite, and they kind of relate much more to that one we saw earlier with the Borghese Gladiator, these academic drawings after these live casts. But I think they're very beautiful. I mean, there's a sort of sensitivity you get in the black and white chalk that you don't get in the same way with the colour. But they're very rare. I mean, there were 6 which went with the commission for Owen Wynn. And I've never seen, there's one I came across from the period when he was in Wales in 1768. But I don't think he ever did black and white again, because I think a bit like photography, people kind of done with black and white photography, they wanted colour photography, and I think they didn't want to commission black and white drawings, they wanted to commission coloured drawings. But I think they're actually the best thing. So this is one of Owen Wynn's children. This is in the National Library of Wales, this drawing. That's one of them. And that's Owen Wynn's daughter, Eleanor. Again, that's in the National Library. Next one, please. And then there are 2 of friends of Owen Wynn who are Jacobites. This is someone called John Pugh Price, who had 2 estates, one at Reed, I mentioned before, Corwin, and another one in Ceredigion called Tregersdale. And in Llanbadenfawr Church, Aberystwyth, is a memorial to John Pugh Price, high up in the church. And he obviously had this rather celebrated profile with his big nose. And there's exactly the same profile as appears on his memorial in the church. But that's a great drawing. Next one, please. And this is Robert Howell Vaughan, another Jacobite, another friend of Owen Wynn's, another friend of Sir Watkin Wynn's, and he became a considerable patron of William Parry, as we'll see later on. But I think great, you know, really wonderful drawing. There's nothing else really like these done. There are no other drawings like these of Welsh sitters done in Wales in the 18th century. They're really incredibly special things. Next one. So then we come on to John Parry, and where William Parry and John Parry interact, and this series of portraits of John Parry, which have rightly been considered to be, you know, William Parry's most important contribution to Welsh painting, sort of generally. And they've been described, Priest Morgan at Swansea, University of Wales, Swansea, said that they're amongst the most important and best portraits painted in the 18th century as a group. And they're very important in Welsh terms because of the bardic imagery, and because John Parry was considered by the Celtic revivalists series of these portraits, as I've said, and they really begin this theme in Welsh painting of these bardic images. Beginning with William Parry and then they go up through the 19th and into the 20th century. And the fact that William Parry was John Parry was blind added greatly to this sense of sort of mystery and mysticism and otherworldliness, really, is the best way to describe it, I think. This one is a view in a room at probably the old Winstead, because Winstead was burnt down in 1858. The young man on the left is David Parry, William Parry's brother, who I mentioned earlier. He's holding the score for Zadok the priest. So what Glyn-y-Weddw was a great enthusiast for Handel's music, and John Parry was an accomplished player of Handel as well. The harp, I'm interested, was probably made in Clanroost in 1755 by someone called John Richard. Like so many of these things that I'll come on to later, it was destroyed, it was burnt at Winstead in a terrible fire in 1858. So this is a small conversation piece, essentially. This is the size, the original picture. This is in the National Museum of Wales as well. Have you seen that? It belonged to descendants of Parry until 1996 when it was sold to the museum. There is a copy of this picture, which belonged to Lady Llanover, who was, in the 19th century, who was a great patron of artists. So, next one. This picture, probably the most famous image of John Parry, been published a lot. It's in the National Museum of Wales. There are two versions of this picture. One of them belonged to Parry's family and was sold by them to the National Museum. And there was another version of it which was at Winstead. And actually it's the only painting by Parry that we know survived the fire at Winstead. And again, it's very illuminating when one looks back, as I did for my book, through the correspondence about the Mileswyncato picture, to see how forgotten William Parry became during the course of the history of painting. Because this picture, probably painted like in about 1770, after Sir Watkin Mileswyncato died, the fourth Baron died in 1790, there was an inventory of pictures at Winstead, and it's very clearly listed as a portrait of the harper John Parry by his son William. So there's no ambiguity about that at all. In 1840, there was another inventory drawn up at Winstead, and it just says portrait of a blind harpist. I think it might say John Parry, the blind harpist, but the artist has disappeared. And then by the end of the 19th century, it's down as a portrait of a musician to the Mileswyncato family by Sir Joshua Reynolds. So it's totally, again, William Parry's been forgotten about. In their terms, it's been elevated to Reynolds. They don't even know who the harpist is anymore. So it's amazing how quickly these things get lost. And when this picture was sold from Winstead in 1946, it was sold to somebody called Brindley Escape, who was an enthusiast for harps and harping, lived near Darlith. There was a long correspondence about this picture and what it was worth and who painted it. And again, William Parry, they talk about all sorts of different painters who could have painted it, but William Parry never gets mentioned in the correspondence purely because by that stage he'd just been so forgotten. Anyway, it's a great thing, obviously, he's actually playing the harp in contrast to this picture. William Parry exhibited three pictures with his father at the Royal Academy during his time as an exhibitor at the Royal Academy. But very interestingly, none of them were of him playing the harp. The first one he exhibited, which was 1778, was a fascinating sounding picture which is lost. And I really hope it'll turn up one day, which describes Mr. Parry playing at drafts with the portrait of two other people, because he was very celebrated, as well as being celebrated as a harpist, he was very celebrated as a player of drafts, which for somebody blind was considered to be a great novelty. But William Parry didn't exhibit a portrait of his father playing the harp. And I think there must have been, his father must for some reason have not wanted to have his picture of him playing exhibited at the Academy. very famous man, friend of Handel and Garrick and all of the, was his son. But his father, of course, never ever saw the pictures because he was blind. Next one, please. So there, you have the advantage on this one because you can see the real thing. This picture is a bit of a mystery. Peter did me upgraded me again very kindly in his introduction. I didn't actually recognise this picture as John Parry because Tom Lloyd got there before me. I think I would have done, but it wasn't me who recognised it, but I did buy it, and I'm very happy to buy it. It's a slight mystery. I think it's a bit later than the other pictures we've seen. It's very hard to really describe why it is, other than if you look at an awful lot of 18th century pictures, you just get a slight sense of quite how they fall in the 18th century. There's something just a little bit later about this picture. But what's interesting about it, though, even though I think it probably dates from the 1780s rather than 1770 when the first ones we saw, is that John Parry looks effectively the same in all the pictures. He's not a young man in some of them and an old man in others, even though he must be slightly different. I think a bit like Elizabeth I. There was an image established of him when Parry first painted him, and that he just continued to paint him, really probably effectively at his peak, rather than making him look like an older man. But William Parry did exhibit a portrait of his father at the Royal Academy in 1787, 5 years after his father had died. So it was a posthumous portrait. It was exhibited as a portrait of the late Mr. Parry. And I think this is probably that picture. And I think probably that would explain why he's not playing the harp. He's kind of communing with it in this, again, rather otherworldly, metaphysical way. And I think it's because he doesn't play the harp anymore because he is dead. But it's got slight feel of a sort of posthumous picture about it. And it was also exhibited in Liverpool. There was an academy set up in Liverpool in the 1780s, which was quite short-lived. It didn't really work. But Parry did send a couple of portraits there, including one of his father, the harpist, and I think that's probably the same picture. But when this picture came up, it has an interesting history because it belonged to someone called Sackville Gwyn from Carmarthenshire, and it's the only real connection that's ever been established between William Parry and South Wales. And Sackville Gwyn was a gentleman harpist. He was a very good triple harp player, taught by John Parry, and a patron of harpists. But and he owned this picture, and he may have bought it at the Royal Academy, conceivably, or he may have commissioned it. We don't know. But on the back of the canvas, it's inscribed in an early script, S. Gwyn, and the family who owned it believed subsequently it was a portrait of Sackville Gwyn, even though the man was blind, quite clearly blind. I suppose they might have thought he was just shutting his eyes. And Sackville Gwyn wasn't blind, and the likeness is, there's no question it's actually John Parry. But it's just a good example of how things can get sort of muddled up over the years through false clues like that. So, next one, please. This is an image from a book of musicals, Alan and Lad, published in 1896 by someone called Nicholas Bennett. And it's interesting because this is the frontispiece to this book from the late 19th century. And clearly, well, it is John Parry in the book, it's called John Parry. And it's the only engraved image of John Parry. And another one of the slight mysteries about William Parry's portraits of his father, which were undoubtedly something which people were very interested in the period, is that they were never engraved. Because one of the ways that artists made money in the 18th century and the 19th century was through selling the engravings of their work. And I'm absolutely sure that a proper mezzotint of one of his portraits from the 1770s or 1780s would have been very successful as a print and would have made him pretty good money. Whether John Parry didn't want his image disseminated in that way, we don't know. William Parry, there's only actually one print after one of William Parry's works, which is quite an obscure portrait, probably commissioned by the man who it's of. So this is the only graphic image after one of William Parry's works. But again, it's interesting because in this frontispiece, it says this is a portrait of John Parry who died in 1782, but it doesn't give William Parry as the artist. So again, whether Mr. Bennett knew it was after William Parry in 1770, he was sent by Sir Watkin-Wynne to Italy, which is where all painters of any ambition in that period needed to go. And they went to study, they went to look at the great old masters, and William Parry had a contract with William Parry had a contract with Sir Watkin-Wynne to go to Italy to study, but during that time he contracted to paint 4 original paintings and 4 copies. He didn't complete all the pictures, though he was there for 5 years, he should have done. He was obviously, apparently they say he was a bit languid in his studies on account of the patronage of Sir Watkin-Wynne. And all the pictures, until I started doing the research for the book, he thought that all the paintings he'd done for Sir Watkin in Italy had been lost or destroyed. In the course of writing my book, I discovered that this picture, which is a copy of Raphael's Transfiguration, which Vasari described as Raphael's greatest work, and it's a huge picture. I mean, it's just about fit on the whole of this wall. This picture survived in a country house in Warwickshire, and this Parry painted a copy of this for the staircase at Sir Watkin-Wynne's new house by the Adam brothers in St James's Square in London. And it's very important because Sir Watkin, as I say, he had the Adam brothers design this house. He filled it with the most expensive art and furniture and silver by the greatest craftsmen of the age. And the painting he chose to hang on the staircase, the most important position in the whole house, was William Parry's copy of the Transfiguration, which I think is very important because I think it shows how Sir Watkin-Wynne regarded his protege, this young man, and sent off to Italy. There is no way in a million years he would have hung this portrait, this picture, even as a copy of another picture, which in that period was considered to be quite fine to have. But he wouldn't have hung it unless he thought it was a really wonderful thing. He was very pleased with it. When William Parry came back from Italy, Sir Watkin gave him a £100 bonus, which was a lot of money, purely because he was so delighted with the works that he painted for him. And he hung in Winstead several of these paintings after Correggio and Michelangelo, and as I say, this one after Raphael was hung on the staircase in St James's Square. This isn't the picture. That picture disappeared. We don't know what happened to it. This one was commissioned in the late 1780s by a baronet called Sir Roger Newdigate, who was a friend of William's from Parry. Parry actually did this from tracing. He took off the Raphael and brought back to Wales from Italy. But it's a wonderful thing, a huge thing. As I say, it survives in the house. It was an amazing discovery to find it was still there. It's the only insight we have into William Parry as a copyist of old masters, which is was a big part of his story. I'll just see a close-up of it. There's a slightly, actually, just gives you slightly better idea of what it's like. Trouble is, these pictures, unless they're signed, or unless we have documentation, we have letters from Sir Roger Newdigate to William Parry and back again, describing the picture and describing the sale process. Without those, nobody would ever know in a million years who these pictures are by. So although we know there are other old master copies by William Parry out there, unless we've got any reason to know they're by him, they could be by anybody, and obviously it's impossible to see his style. Next one. After William Parry came back in the mid-1770s, he got married and he established himself in London, and he went backwards and forwards from Wales to London, and he was working in both places. He started exhibiting at the Royal Academy, which had just been established. 1776 was the first year he exhibited there, and he exhibited in 7 paintings, so it was really quite an accolade. And he painted some very interesting things in 1780. This picture is a portrait of someone called Omai, the man on the left, who's a Polynesian native, brought over to Britain by Captain Cook. And in the middle of someone called Sir Joseph Banks, who was a great naturalist, and someone called Dr. Selander, who's a Swedish naturalist on the right. This picture was bought 10 years ago Acton Cook Museum and the National Portrait Gallery. I think it was £1 million. Something like that. And there was a lot of publicity about it because it's a very important picture because of the subject. But one of the things that spurred me on to write my book was that in all the publicity about the picture, William Parry was given as the artist, but there was really nothing about him because no one knew him. Or there wasn't anywhere that a journalist could go to get information about him in any meaningful way. So a very important picture. This was actually at Nanai, the house owned by Robert Howell Vaughan, sort of black and white drawing of him earlier on. So that's probably Parry's most famous picture, but as I say, he was missed out when it was being sold in terms of being the artist. And Reynolds also painted Omar, a very famous picture. We don't really know very much about this picture until the 19th century. It's a bit of a mystery. Why it was never exhibited and how it was actually where it was commissioned. Next one. This is a portrait of someone called Thomas Lewis, who was painted by Parry for the Welsh Charity School in London. There's another picture, there's a companion picture of someone called Richard Jones, who was the vice treasurer of the school. And these pictures are important because the Charity School and Jesus College, Oxford, which were two of the sort of main institutions in England with very strong Welsh connections, really Welsh foundations, they both commissioned William Parry in this period to paint pictures for them. So there was a very conscious patronage from these institutions in England of Parry as the Welsh painter to go to. So they were very conscious of that. And these pictures survive with documentation. So that's quite important to see how Parry was regarded in his period in England. Next one. The patronage from the Swat Communes Wyn didn't last a great deal of time after Parry came back from Italy, primarily because Swatkin had spent so much money, even though he was very rich, he almost went bankrupt. Because it cost him a fortune to build his house in London, he was spending money absolutely everywhere as if it was going out of fashion, and he had to stop. His agent was continually saying to him, please don't buy any more pictures. My wife says to me sometimes. But there was a bit more to come, and this picture was a picture I found in America a few years ago, and it's a portrait of Swat Communes Wyn's two eldest sons. The one with the boy on the right in red became the 5th baronet, and the one on the left is someone called Charles Swat Communes Wyn. And you can see again the spreading tree, the landscape. It's very similar in some ways to those pictures we saw from 1770, although I think this was painted about 1783. No Parry was back in Wales. And it's very unusual because it's circular. It's a big picture. I mean, it would fill, it's twice the size of this one. And when I saw it, I knew it was by William Parry. Although, again, like so many of William Parry's pictures, it had been called Beachy and Oakley and all these other painters. People thought it was by anybody except Parry. But because it was circular, I had a feeling that maybe it had been painted for the London house because the Adam brothers used a lot of circular motifs in their classical decoration. And sure enough, I did manage to find a country life photograph of the London house at the beginning of the 20th century. And this picture was hanging in the dining room. Unmistakable, this great big circular canvas. Anyway, it's very exciting to find that. We managed to buy it back from America, and it's back in the house in Wales now with a descendant of the little boy who's sort of riding the dog. Next one, please. This is an image, as you can see from the title, the Royal Academy in 1787. Parry exhibited about 30 pictures at the Royal Academy in his time, only one of which we now know of, which shows you the power many of these pictures are lost. There's a real problem with the Academy in this period, that so many pictures, particularly portrait painters, were literally just listed as a portrait of a gentleman, a portrait of a lady, so it's very, very hard to trace them. However, sometimes there are a series of these images of the Academy with the pictures in them, and they're numbered, and we can cross-reference the numbers, the tiny little engraved numbers under the pictures in the engraving to the list that are extant of the paintings exhibited. And by a stroke of wonderful luck, this image of the Academy in 1787, the three pictures which are highlighted there in blue are all by William Parry. We know that because they're numbered. And the one on the right-hand side, which you probably can't see very well from where you're sitting, but is a portrait of a sort of gentleman standing in a landscape. If we go to the next image, that is the picture. So that tiny engraving, which is a few millimetres high in the engraving, we can see is an accurate representation of this portrait, which is great because the other two pictures in the engraving are lost. So whenever they turn up, we've got a pretty good idea what they look like. We know what they are. This is a portrait of someone called Trevor Lloyd, who owned an estate near Llangollen. There's Demas Brown in the background. This portrait still belongs to his ancestor who lives near Mould. But again, it's yet another example of a picture which was forgotten. It was by William Parry. It was considered to be by Richard Wilson, who of course came from Mould himself, or near Mould himself. So for many years, right well into the 20th century, this was considered to be by Richard Wilson. But we know very well it isn't, because it was exhibited by Parry at the Royal Academy. Next one. I mentioned earlier Robert Howell Vaughan and Nanai being a patron of Parry. That house, I don't know if any of you know, but it's outside Dolgeffer, high up near Llanfairpwll. And it was the house was sold in the 1960s. It belonged to a family it belonged to his descendants, the Vaughans. And actually, one of those sad things, in retrospect, we can see that after the fire at Wednesday, which destroyed so much of the Wednesday collection of pictures by Parry, Nanai had the best collection, or the most comprehensive collection of work by Parry in it. But it's only really been since the house has been sold and the collections have been dispersed and gradually been recognised that we've realised this. It wasn't realised in the 20th century when the collections were being dispersed. These pictures, for instance, were only sold about 3 years ago. And it's only when they came on the market that we realised they were by Parry, because nobody's really seen them for 25 years. So that's Robert Howell Vaughan on the left and his wife on the right. Those are now in the National Museum of Wales and can be seen down there as well. Next one. There's a portrait of Parry's son, eldest son, which was done at the same time as the pair we just seen. You can see again he's in the same what they call Van Dyck costume with that broad 17th century collar. Another nice child portrait, very good, so it's not a one for him. Next one, please. Parry also drew chalk portraits of the three boys. This is the middle son, Edward Salisbury Vaughan, his name is. Again, he's a very nice quality chalk drawing, but he's still got these 20 years after he first done them. Next one, please. I'll just show you the corner of this frame because this has been quite an interesting thing. I found several of these chalk portraits by Parry over the years. They are very distinctive when you begin to know what they look like. Quite often they're not signed or anything, but very often in these original, the frame survives on them as this type of frame, which is clearly just the type of frame that he favoured. And there have been one or two occasions where I bought them without having at auction, without having seen the frame, and then they turned up and the frame's been the icing on the cake. So I thought, well, there we are, it's in Parry's frame. So if you remember that frame, you might find one. This is just a sort of oddity, really, the kind of thing that turns up when one's doing sort of work on a particular painter. This is just a landscape drawing, which there's a long story to this, and I've told it in my book already, but this was called a work by William Parry when I bought it, and it would have been very strange if there hadn't been a very good reason for that. He did write to his parents that when he was in Italy, he did some landscape drawing. So this is probably a unique survival over just a sort of landscape sketch by Parry. And you can see that in the background some of these portraits he could do landscapes. But these pictures of these artists tend to be very fragmentary, and we just get these little clues is rather a poignant picture, and this kind of brings the story towards the end, really. This is a portrait of, this is the last picture known by William Parry. It's of his son, John. His wife had died in childbirth very sadly some years before, which had hit him very hard. But he had this son, and when he went back to Italy again for a second time, William Parry, in about 1789, the year Sir Watkin Mileswyncato died, the patron. And he left this picture. Clearly it's unfinished, you can see by the collar and the hand it's not finished, but it's rather beautiful study. The head is clearly pretty well finished. And he left this young boy with his uncle, David, the musician, and went back to Italy. And this man, it's interesting because he also became an artist when he grew up. In the documentation of the baptism of his eldest daughter, he's called a limner, which was a word for an artist, and a portrait painter particularly. And there are one or two prints after his work. He was a schoolmaster. He had a school in Wrexham. And I did recently find a portrait, a very accomplished portrait actually, signed J. Parry, which I think is probably by him to the right period. But William Parry went back to Italy in 1789, and he was only there for a relatively short time. He did some more copies of old master paintings, and then came back to Britain. He was ill. We don't know what was wrong with him. He was only 42 years old. And he came back to Britain and died very shortly afterwards. And several things happened subsequent to his death, which really account for this obscurity that he fell into so quickly. There was a big sale of his work very shortly after he died, and a lot of his paintings were dispersed. His great patron, Sir Watkin Mileswyncato, died in 1789. Robert Howell Vaughan died about the same time as him. So a lot of these people who'd been his champions died around the same time. And with the dispersal of his work at auction, and then the Great Fire at Wednesday in 1858, a lot of his work had survived in Wednesday, but it was lost. This fire was a calamity. So much of the Williams-Williams collections were lost in the fire. So there was a great purging of his things in that process. So there are fewer and fewer of his works surviving. And then those few things that did survive probably the fire. In 1946 there was a huge sale at Wednesday. Pictures were sold in a terrible time to be selling anything, but they were sold for nothing. So there was a sort of triple filtering out of Parry's work for the Williams-Williams. Almost nothing other than that portrait of John Parry we saw earlier survived. So one comes into the sort of middle of the 20th century, and John Steedman from the National Museum of Wales was going around doing his books of portraits in Welsh houses. Some of you may be familiar with lists of all the portraits in country houses. And it's quite clear from these books that he has no knowledge that there was an important Welsh portrait painter operating in North Wales in the 1770s and 80s. Because again and again, like some of the pictures we've seen, there are pictures which, if he'd had a consciousness of the Jacobites and of Wednesday's influence and William Parry, he would have looked at these pictures and thought, small full-length portrait, 1770, William Parry could have painted that. It just didn't happen. So this obscurity has really been, a profound element in the history of this painter. And that's why I was very keen to write the book, because it was quite clear to me that this here was a very important and very interesting and very accomplished Welsh artist. He represents an important chapter in the history of the culture, visual culture of Wales. And I've been lucky enough to have some pictures by him to accumulate a lot of information about him, and was very keen to represent it to Wales. So I hope that's given you a flavour. The whole story is in the book. Please do buy the book if you've got the time. And